What would you do if you were locked up in a prison that was designed to be inescapable? You might try escaping over the fence or through the window. But what if both those options were blocked? Well, you could always dig a tunnel, right? As long as you had enough time, a lot of men, and a whole lot of spoons. Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today we're gonna take a look inside one of World War II's most daring prison breaks. If you like the sound of that, then please remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any more of our videos. Now, let's get into it. So where exactly did this story take place? In Germany, at a prison camp known as Stalag Luft III. At its peak, the camp housed around 5,000 prisoners, all of them airmen captured by the Luftwaffe during the war. Now, if you're thinking Stalag Luft sounds a bit similar to the real-life concentration camps established by the Nazis, well, you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, they were very similar. Prisoners were forced to do hard labor under threat of violence or death. There was also an infamous guard tower and armed guards who patrolled the perimeter, and that's just for starters. However, unlike the other camps, Stalag Luft III was designed primarily to hold POWs who were considered too valuable to execute, which meant that the camp authorities usually tried to treat them a little better than your average prisoner. The facilities were slightly nicer, and there was a small canteen with basic amenities such as soap, tobacco, and stationery. It even had a makeshift barbershop. In the summer, officers were permitted to play sports such as volleyball and football. Occasionally, the camp would put on theatrical productions and sing-alongs to boost morale. Still, this was a prison camp. The prisoners were regularly beaten and tortured, and the threat of transfer to another camp always loomed large. It was here that a group of Allied soldiers decided they'd had enough. Let's meet our heroes. Over the course of several months, in 1943 and 1944, a number of British, Australian, Canadian, and Polish airmen came together to plan the most audacious escape from a prison camp ever seen. While the Allies certainly weren't naive enough to think they could storm the camp gates and fight their way to freedom, they believed that if they dug 3 separate tunnels under the camp's perimeter fence, they might stand a chance. After all, how could a Nazi guard stationed above ground know that prisoners were tunneling underneath? Now, to keep a lookout, the men dubbed themselves Tom, Dick, and Harry. These 3 men were on duty 24 hours a day, keeping an ear out for anything that might indicate the collapse of the tunnel or an approaching German patrol. If things started going south, their job was to alert the rest of the POWs, who would then try to hide as best they could. Of course, digging 3 tunnels under a prison camp isn't easy, even if it is the best way out. So, where to begin? Well, the first step is to acquire the necessary tools. For this, the POWs turned to some unlikely sources. The latrines, each of the 18 wooden sheds used by the 5,000 inmates in the camp, had 2 bucket toilets, which were later replaced with proper flush toilet. However, the men soon discovered these could also be useful for something else. By melting down the metal handles of the toilet seats, the men were able to create makeshift spoons that were perfect for digging. And believe it or not, this actually worked. Within weeks, the men had made 3 60-foot tunnels beneath the barbed wire fence and into the surrounding forest. But the work wasn't done yet. There was still one major obstacle, a 12-foot wide corridor that connected the 3 tunnels to the fence, known as the Little Lubang. This narrow passageway proved a huge challenge for the men who needed to dig another 20 feet under a 16-foot wall. This meant the team had to start digging upwards. As the men dug with their spoons, they carefully removed dirt and debris from the top of the tunnel and hid it in sacks. These sacks were then carried out of the camp by friendly guards, who were bribed with tobacco and alcohol, and dumped outside the perimeter. After all, it's not every day you get to help smuggle prisoners out of a prison camp. By late March 1944, The tunnels were complete. All that was left to do was wait for the right moment to strike. The men agreed that the breakout would only happen at night, and they would need a clear night with no wind or rain. At 10 p.m. on March, the go-ahead was given. More than 70 prisoners slipped through the tunnels. Many more waited their turn. But it was only a matter of time before the Germans realized what was happening. Let's find out who made it out and who didn't. Once outside the fence, the POWs had to travel 12 miles to the relative safety of a small village called Sagon. From there, they would make their way to the border of neutral Sweden, which was only 40 miles away. The escapees made good time, moving silently through the darkness and hiding from the occasional Nazi patrol. By 2 a.m., most of the men had made it to Sagan. They ditched their uniforms for civilian clothes and shaved off their military-style haircuts. Then they waited for transportation to the Swedish border, which unfortunately never came. Instead, the men were forced to trek the remaining distance on foot, enduring hunger, fatigue, and exposure to the elements. 3 of the escapees froze to death in the forest. Another was shot by a German sentry. 1 man jumped into a river and drowned, and 2 more were recaptured by the Gestapo after being betrayed by a local farmer who recognized one of the men from his aircrew. The remaining 74 POWs eventually made it to Sweden, where they were greeted as heroes. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the men who didn't escape. Just after dawn, the Germans noticed that 3 of the tunnel entrances had been covered over. Soon, they had arrested the ringleaders of the breakout and were interrogating them as to who helped them dig the tunnels. The men refused to cooperate, and so the Germans retaliated by moving them to another camp, working as a form of punishment. And here's where the story takes a dark turn. Unable to determine who had actually escaped, the Germans rounded up the entire population of Stalag Luft III, working out the 3,000 men who hadn't been involved in the breakout by process of elimination. They then executed all of them, including 16 officers who had been moved to the camp for their own safety. Only 30 of the original 74 men who escaped would survive the war. It was a devastating blow, but the impact went far beyond Stalag Luft III. Across the globe, people learned of the fate of the 3,000 men, and sympathy for the POWs ran high. The British press was particularly harsh on the Germans, accusing them of breaking the Geneva Accords by executing the men. In reality, the Germans had probably just been angry. After all, they had spent months planning the most audacious prison break in history, and it had almost worked. It was dubbed The Great Escape in the book and film of the same name, and for good reason. It remains the single largest mass escape attempt from a prison camp in history. It has been estimated that if all the POWs in Stalag Luft III had attempted the breakout, around 15,000 men could have escaped. What's more, the Great Escape had a profound effect on morale in Britain and helped keep alive the belief that victory was possible. There are many other great stories from World War II that most people have never heard of. If you'd like to learn more about this incredible conflict, then check out the series in the description below. You can learn about Hitler's lost battles, secret weapons, and the Allies' equally brilliant strategies. That's all from me. See you next time.